I think we have heard two very different or rather different perspectives on the history of Europe, and not least the one presented by Johann Arnason, which takes a very long historical perspective to arrive at a view of the current situation, and another one from Gerard Delanty, which, while being historical, takes a shorter-term perspective over the last 2 centuries rather than the last 2 millennia. And I would like to open our discussion by nevertheless pointing to some points of intersection, because overall I want to suggest that the two analyses, they are different but rather complementary at the same time. And these points of intersections may then at the same time be starting points for a debate to make visible where the differences and maybe also the complementarities are. Very broadly, I think we can say that Johann Arnason arrived at the characterization of contemporary Europe from the point of view of the emergence of a new civilization, the civilization of modernity, roughly half a millennium ago, a process starting at around 1500, whereas Gerard Delanty was looking at the relation between capitalism and democracy, thus at phenomena which more or less date to 2 centuries ago from the period of around 1800. Similarly, or in consequence, we might say that Johann Arnason's perspective is more political-cultural, whereas Gerard Delanty's is more politico-economic. And I want to formulate 2 questions to them together, where they may start and continue the dialogue that exists by underlining these features. If we take Johann Arnason's perspective, he was emphasizing that the advent of that new civilization of modernity was most strongly characterized by an unprecedented emphasis of the idea of autonomy of the human being. Whereas Gerard Delanty was pointing out that the specificity of Europe over the past 2 centuries, a shorter period, is the emergence of the social, we may say, an understanding of society as something that exists separate from the market and the state. So the question to the two of them would be whether there are ways to combine these 2 emphases, because the autonomy, especially if we think of the autonomy of the individual human being, stands in tension to the social or an idea of society, and in turn the idea of the social of society stands in tension to the individualizing moments of the market, but also the individualizing moment of at least democratic politics, where after all it is the unit citizen, the individual, the voter and citizen, who is the core component of that polity. The emphasis on autonomy and the emphasis on the social, in what way do they correspond to each other? Can you recognize the other's point of view in this opposition? That is my first question to both of them. The second question refers to a different matter. I think we can say, so going back to my initial proposition of different narratives of European history, that both our speakers have emphasized conflict rather than harmony in European history. But conflicts of rather different kinds. I mean, both of them in the end have emphasized, in one way maybe as a culmination point in the long history of Europe, in the other way as a moment in which the tensions of capitalism explode, the First World War, and in a sense as the extension of the First World War, the Second World War. However, in Johann Arnason's perspective, the First World War is the consequence of imperial competition, inter-imperial tensions, thus related to states and their military power and their interests in the world. Whereas in Gerard Delanty's view, the wars are the result of economic rivalry, the tensions between the economic drive towards expansion and the stability of the political form. So in the one case, we have a political, ultimately a political explanation, if I understood it correctly, of the tensions that characterize recent 20th century Europe. In the other case, one that relates the economic to the political, but ultimately focuses on the economic tensions. Again, my question to you would be, and to formulate it in more topical terms, is the current crisis predominantly a crisis between European states that don't manage to interact with each other in a peaceful and harmonious way as they were able to do for a couple of decades? Or is it predominantly a capitalist crisis that then has political consequences on the relation between the states? I propose to give the word first to Johann to address these questions and maybe also other aspects you would like to emphasize in Delanty's presentation.
On the question of the characteristics of modernity as a new civilization, is it an emphasis on autonomy, or does it have more to do with a social conception of society? Now, I think you can find a certain emphasis on a social understanding of society in various civilizations, in tension with other approaches. I would argue, for example, that in the Chinese tradition, you have quite a marked degree of tension between state-centered and social conceptions of society, both within the Confucian tradition and in the difference between Confucianism and legalism. What is new about European modernity, I think, is more that a social conception of society places more emphasis on society as an ongoing self-creation. And if it's a question of social justice, then on the ability to devise and implement principles of justice, all of which takes us back to autonomy. So my view would rather be that the new civilization of autonomy opens up or gives rise to a whole spectrum of state-centered, market-centered, and social conceptions of society. Let me very briefly add a remark to that and to comment on what Gerard said about European integration being an elite-led project. Yes, but what exactly are we complaining about when we describe it as an elite-led project? I mean, not that it could have been done in a radically other way. The elites are always with us, and there are no great historical transformations without their involvement. So what you can have in mind, I think, is only a lack of something else to complement or counterbalance the elite action. An underdeveloped public sphere, a lack of democratic legitimacy, or lack of involvement of social movements. You can make a case for all that, but then I think you need to be more specific about exactly what kind of counterweight or corrective to elite action you want. Second point, conflict versus harmony, and the question whether we were stressing different kinds of conflict. When I talked about inter-imperial conflict, I didn't mean to downgrade the importance of the conflictuality of the economic sphere. The empires are acting in a global environment that is constantly being transformed by the development of capitalist accumulation on world scale, but it is the imperial rivalry as such that brings about the military conflict. I'll just round this off with a final observation that has less to do with the questions. When we try to define the present crisis, crisis of what? And there's no simple answer to that. It's a multidimensional crisis. It's a crisis of many things and in many different ways. But one useful way of looking at it, I think, is to treat it as a crisis of a whole set of assumptions, ideological dogmas, as it were, that prevailed in the 90s in the aftermath of the great geopolitical shift. And you can put a name to at least 4 of those interconnected assumptions. The one that may be least remembered today but should not be forgotten was the myth of the new economy. And I call it a myth because I'm referring here to Christoph Deutschmann's analysis of capitalist development as mythogenic. The new economy, at the time it was quite explicit. It's not often referred to today, but this was a myth that technological progress had overcome the business cycle. It was a no more boom and bust idea. We had moved into a phase of capitalist development that would no longer be plagued by cyclical crisis. It was the assumption of definitive harmonization of democracy and capitalism that had simply ruled out the possibility of alternatives. And it was also the myth of a unipolar world dominated by the United States in a way that the world had never before been dominated by one power. It was the last Rome. There is an eerie resemblance between this idea and the much older Russian one of the last Rome. So one useful way, I think, of looking at the present crisis is to treat it as a disintegration of a new imaginary that took shape at the end of the 20th century. Well, I could go on about this for a longer time, but let me stop here.
Thank you, Johann.
I can just offer very brief comments to two answers to your two questions. My answer to your first is that in my approach I would prefer to emphasize the decisive role that social movements played in the formation of modernity. And when I spoke of the relationship between civil society, economy and state, I mostly had in mind the role of social movements in terms of the model of civil society. And I think that well, that leads me to an answer to your second question on the relationship between a view that emphasizes conflict versus a view that emphasizes harmony. I would break down conflict into many different levels. There's, first of all, conflict in the sense of, as the word suggests, of oppositional movements or states war, etc. But also a perspective that would emphasize not so much that level of conflict, but diversity and pluralization. And I would want to distinguish those different levels. Well, it's often said, in a way, it's sort of the motto of the European Union of unity and diversity. And I think that that could be said to be an aspect of the European legacy, a notion of unity and diversity. Though I know one could say that about other parts of the world, certainly about, for instance, India, of all it is the motto of the Republic of India, the Unity and Diversity. So I would want to approach it in this way, and regarding the emphasis I placed on social movements as agents that reflect what you referred to as the autonomy, not just of the human being, but of the collective social actor. I think that could be seen as having a decisive role in the formation of modernity in Europe, that was reflected in many different things, including this emphasis on a social as opposed to a state or market-based conception of society.
Thank you very much, Gerard. We have some time for broader discussion, so I invite comments or questions from the audience. Yes, please. Wait for a moment for the microphone, please.
Two questions, please. One question is about the European Parliament. In each country, the parliament is the main association but in Europe, Parliament is the latest semblance. And and the second question is, what's the model of the of Europa? I think the model is the United States of America. I remember in 1956 on Rome agreement, Mr. Spack says our target is to be the United States of Europe. If we visited United States of America, people are very proud of their country. But here in Europe, in United Kingdom, Spain, Germany, I'm not sure, but Europe is not something important, is something secondary. The interest of each country, it's bigger, more bigger than the global interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who wants to go? Gerard?
Well, let me try to answer at least your first question about the European Parliament, and I'm not quite sure exactly what the question there is, but if I would say that if what we're talking about here is democracy, and the idea that Parliament, that national parliaments, or the main voices of democracy is something I think that we should be somewhat sceptical of. And I'm not entirely convinced that democracy is only about Parliament. Democracy consists of at least three elements. It consists of to be sure, the electoral level, the representation of social interests, but it also consists of citizenship, of the inclusion of the individual being in society, a whole range of institutions of citizenship, and thirdly, it concerns constitutionalism. Now, if you look at the record of European integration, I don't think it's particularly good as regards democracy. It never said democracy as one of its aims, but in fact, it didn't do too badly when measured against a broader notion of democracy. It's done quite a lot on the level of constitutionalism, the question of certain rights, anti-discrimination legislation, for instance. So the fact that the European Parliament is different in its function to national parliaments is not, in my view, indicative of a fundamental problem of democracy at the European level. Rather, one should see the institution of democracy as multi-leveled on the national level, and indeed too on the European level and a whole range of other levels. So I don't actually see that as a problem. It certainly would be a problem if we were dependent on the European Parliament to deliver democracy. So that would be my answer to that question. And I certainly don't think the United States is a good model for Europe. For the United States is, after all, a nation state, and I don't think the model of the nation state is a good model for something like the project of European integration. Maybe far too great demands are being made of it to do things, and Johann Arnason mentioned earlier the famous book by Andrew Millward, The European Rescue of the Nation State. In many ways, he was right. The European integration project was all about the rescue of the nation state, and of course it did many other things too, but increasingly far too great demands are made of it, including demands to deliver democracy. So I don't think, I agree, and it's a good question, we need to look for a model, but I'm not sure that that model is necessarily another existing one. I've often said that Switzerland is probably the best model of a federal model for Europe. It's cosmopolitan and xenophobic, and well, with an interesting European history. Perhaps if we had to look for another national model, I think would be rather interested in that one. But I'm not sure an existing one is the one that we should aspire to.
Thank you, Gerard. Johann?
Well, let me reflect a bit on the second question. I don't think I have an answer to it, but if you think of European integration as a process of state formation sui generis, well, then the only conceivable end to it is some kind of federal structure. But if you then try to imagine the United States as a model, which I don't think is a good idea, well, then the question becomes whether you find an equivalent to American nationalism, US nationalism, let us call it by its right name. I prefer to stop talking about patriotism because it tends to come with the assumption that Anglo-Saxons have patriotism and other nations have nationalism. But the United States is a nation state, as Gerard stressed. How did it become a nation state? I agree with the historians who stress that the Civil War, so-called Civil War in the United States, was a conflict between two processes of nation formation. That there was a southern process of nation formation that was well, overrun and defeated by the victory of the North in the Civil War. What then followed, of course, was a kind of creeping compromise between the victor and the defeated. Well, that I think is the historical background to US nationalism. We cannot imagine anything similar in Europe. Switzerland, I think, is not a model. There is only one Switzerland. It's inimitable. It's a kind of self-limiting process of state formation produced by very peculiar historical circumstances, very much, I think, a byproduct of the dynamics of the Holy Roman Empire. But we can't go into that now. In short, I think, well, there is a big gap here, a big vacuum. We don't have an answer to the question. What kind of political culture would become the mainstay of a federal Europe?
Thank you, Johann.
Well, in any case, I think if Europe wants to run and to work, we need a common language. For example, Karl the Fourth, when he founded the Karls-Universidad 665 years ago, the Latin was the common language. Afterwards, they changed about 1800 to German in Prague. And the most spoken language of Europe is German, but we know the computer language, the world language is English. Everybody knows that. So why can't we fix once the English as a common language for Europe starting? Everybody has to know it. 2030. I wouldn't give anybody the driving license if he doesn't speak English. And you will see how fast they learn English. And then we can understand each other. This is the basis. The model of Swiss, I understand this is very difficult, whereas many people can understand each other quite easily. And in Switzerland, the major part is the German-speaking part, 65%, and the French part, they accept the majority because there is a culture there. So that's okay. But in Europe, we need the English, a common vehicle, which is the language.
Gerard, if you want, yes. I was about to say that because Prague was mentioned, Johann might want to respond, but feel free.
Well, A short answer is, well, I don't agree, not because I want to protect the English language, but no common language has ever been created without an army to back it up. And that's been the historical experience. And I think a feature, more seriously, an answer to your question is a feature of Europe has been diversity. And I think that's an important aspect of Europe. And right, in other parts of the world, in particular in Asia, multilinguality is not really a problem. And maybe it's not a bad thing if people misunderstand each other. I don't think that having a perfect understanding of anything is the aspiration. So if many people are speaking many different languages and only half understanding each other, I think that's not necessarily a problem, in my view.
Yeah, I'd like to question the claim that no common language has been created without an army to back it up. I mean, there's a very important work by the American Indologist Sheldon Pollock on what he calls the Sanskrit cosmopolis. Sanskrit became a common language of the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia without military expansion to back it up. It's at least an interesting historical case. About the present situation, well, English is our lingua franca in multiple domains. Mehr auch nicht, ganz richtig. Mehr auch nicht, but
Explain yourself precisely, elegantly. It's not possible.
Well, I think we are stuck with this situation. English is a lingua franca, but with the limitations inherent in that concept. But I think we'll simply have to live with this, the complementarity of English as lingua franca, and the indispensability of other European languages. I don't think we can.
One thing you said is that this is a crisis of the state, or of the nation state, as you said it. However, I mean, we would say that there's new states arising every day, every year at least. And even here in Europe, we have the case of Catalonia, which is well known for most of people here, and Scotland, and probably the nearly slow disintegration of the Belgian state. So I wanted to ask you, both of you, how should Europe, or how is Europe going to tackle this new state arising in this structure of states? Is this part of this crisis of the nation state, or is this just a different feature of the nation state? Because nobody is proposing a different kind of state. It's just they're proposing another state just like the other. So, so this is my first question. Sorry, and second question. You also said that this crisis needs an alliance between the states and the political left, if I understood you well. First is, I mean, do you see this happening? Because someone would say that there's a certain fragmentation between institutional left, which is kind of shielding itself into the state, and alternative, or sort of alternative left, which is more and more anti-European and anti-even nation state. So I would like you to clarify this position. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't have good answers to your questions. Let me take the second one first. I'm simply asking myself the question here: who would be the agents of change? And looking at the wave of social protest across Europe and other parts of the world, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere, like the Occupy movement, etc., and these protest movements that have been particularly present in this country, I'm somewhat sceptical that these movements have a capacity to bring about change on their own. They possibly have a capacity to politicize political discourse, but they don't have a capacity to bring about change. So I'm simply suggesting that only the European left, yes, the more institutionalized European left, might have a capacity to bring about. I agree the signs are not. There's no indications of such a movement. It's one reason why one might be a little bit pessimistic is that there's no political capacity to bring about societal transformation at the moment. And yeah, so that I'm pretty much posing that as a question. Who would be the social actors? And I can't answer that question myself. Regarding your first question, yes, I mean, I referred to a crisis of the state, not of the nation state. So I don't feel quite able to address your question about what are the three main secessionist, nationalist movements in Western Europe. I would comment that, I mean, the historical experience has been, at least as far as Western Europe is concerned, is towards a decline in secessionist, nationalist movements. But of course, these are three ones, and I don't have any useful comments to make. I've observed the situation in Scotland, and I personally think it's unlikely that Scotland would become an independent nation state. It's what the most probable outcome will be that Scotland will negotiate more favourable terms for itself. That's the most likely outcome. And I don't think that solutions can be found to economic problems only on the level of the nation state, but there has been, of course, an affirmation of the nation state in recent years, and one can see these three movements as which derive from pretty prosperous parts of Europe, Antwerp, Barcelona, and Edinburgh, as a reflection of an economic crisis. But I don't have particularly something to say on the apparent revival of secessionist nationalism in Europe.
Señor Delanty, ¿cómo ve la exportación de los productos españoles a Europa, que el 60% sale desde Cataluña y su economía e industria? ¿Otra vez? ¿Cómo ve la exportación de los productos españoles a Europa? El 60% sale desde Cataluña y su economía e industria.
I think that's most interesting. I don't have a view on that. Perhaps you might explain what you're suggesting.
Esto lo digo que si fuera independiente Cataluña tendríamos mucha cosa a exportar a Europa, ¿eh? Y creo que sobreviviríamos.
I certainly, for one, don't doubt that.
La mitad es de multinacionales de la exportación.
Okay, there's one, maybe the final question for tonight. One more.
Yeah, there's one. I think this topic of democracy and versus capitalism has another important aspect, which is the atomization of the society. We are, let's say, through the new technological development, much more individualized, but at the same time much more supervised. We are going back, let's say, up to supervised and undemocratic behaving of the people. You know what I mean? So that is a very important question, I think, which is an overall movement in Europe, which now in Hungary has also quite disastrous consequences.
I'm not sure that I entirely understand the question. Could we ask him to elaborate a little?
Well, maybe if maybe I can not really respond, but try to address the question. if I understand it correctly, maybe I rephrase it first. I think that you observe and you say that a bit in contrast to the idea of the social and the capacity of society to self-create itself, that we have a kind of individualization which turns atomization because individuals are separate from each other and don't develop common norms of acting and behaving by being together, but as individuals, and that then we have in reaction to that rather authoritarian forms of government instead of social forms of government. And you give an example. And personally, myself would certainly say that there is considerable truth in that observation, that we, in the constellation which I think we have described earlier on here, there is the risk, indeed the sometimes very clearly perceivable risk of losing social connections between human beings and focusing on the individual as a market agent on the one hand, but also as a political agent, but neglecting the connections between them, which as such are, and these processes are furthered by the development of capitalism on the one hand, but also by the development of political forms in which of which to some extent the European Union is an example, in which the common ties between those human beings are thin or non-existent. That is my rephrasing and also attempt to address it, but maybe Gerard or Johann want to...
Can only agree and with the observation, and hence the emphasis I've placed on the social dimension of citizenship and of democracy, and the absence of that is in many ways reflected in the rise of something that we haven't talked about because it wasn't central to my talk, namely an increase in racism and xenophobic politics, which can be seen as a reaction to such forms of, well, atomization, as you've characterized it, or societal fragmentation.
So maybe the very last question, yes? Okay, maybe we take these two questions together and then give a final word to our speakers, please.
I found your statement about the coupling and decoupling of capitalism and democracy interesting, but I think one of the connecting factors between those two in Europe, and to some extent the United States, has been the rule of law. And I think one of the reasons that we are seeing a decoupling of these is the loosening or the weakening of the rule of law within our collective societies. And until those that are among the rich and political classes are not really beholden to the rule of law and can act with impunity, or when we say, you know, not only are corporations too big to fail, but they're too big to go after judicially, then we have a problem.
Okay, maybe we go immediately on to the last question.
Hello. My question is, I think it's simple, but actually, well, anyway. As Professor Gerard said, the normal condition to capitalism is this crisis. And my question is, what about democracy? Are we going to, do you see any positive way out after this crisis, once it's not only economic crisis, right? It has something to do with values, it has something to do with the individuals and the social movement. What about the way out of this crisis to the democracy? Do you see any positive result, this close of this crisis to democracy?
Thank you very much. Gerard, do you want to?
Well, let me try to take that one first, and I would say that, assuming that some solutions could be found to the current financial crisis, there's of course one other great crisis, namely the ecological crisis. And well, maybe the solution to both of those is the same one, the formation of entirely new economies based on low carbon technologies, for example, that might be one way forward. And so crisis, I think, is a normal part of the social condition, of societies. And I've emphasized the return of the economic crises of capitalism. But that's not to say there won't be other crises. It's all a question of the capacity of the social to address those crises. Yeah, I simply agree with the comment that you've made regarding the rule of law. I would just comment only that, in my view, the European integration project has been relatively successful in bringing about tremendous legal change in the member state countries, and not just only in the economic area, but in the whole area of rights, the area of environment, for example. So I think that was actually a success, one of the successful parts of European integration. But of course, it's inadequate when it comes to dealing with the whole banking sector, and the legal capacity doesn't exist there.
Gerard, final word, Johann?
Maybe a final observation on the rule of law. I mean, are we seeing a weakening of the rule of law? Or a strengthening? I mean, there is the increasing emphasis on constitutionalism. There is a juridification of a lot of things that were regulated in different ways before. But yes, there is a weakening that you can observe in some respects. It's difficult, as you pointed out, to bring economic miscreants to book. I mean, I'm afraid my native country is becoming an extreme example of that, contrary to what is sometimes written about it abroad. So some kind of strange combination of maybe even an hypertrophy and a weakening of the rule of law is going on. Perhaps I should finish with a quotation from a book that I was discussing with Peter earlier on. Many of you may know it. Gekaufte Zeit by Wolfgang Streeck on the crisis of democratic capitalism. Which, well, somewhere at the end you find the pithy description. Die Demokratie zerfällt heute in Rechtsstaat und öffentliche Unterhaltung. Roughly translated, democracy is decomposing into the rule of law and public entertainment. I think there is some truth in that. And on that note, I will end.
Okay. Thank you very much, Johann Arnason and Gerard Delanty, and all members of the audience, for your interest and your participation. Let me just say in conclusion that our discussion will continue in 4 weeks' time, 4 weeks and a day, on Tuesday, the 21st of May, with Juan Díaz Medrano from the Universidad Carlos III in Madrid and Maurizio Bach from the University of Passau in Germany, under the heading of the Europeanization of Society. Thank you very much.